Welcome to episode number 35 of Roots. I'm glad that you're joining me this week, and I hope you had a great holiday weekend. I hope you didn't overeat, and I certainly hope that you didn't end up out on Black Friday beating away people who wanted the same thing that you wanted, and there weren't enough of them to go around. We're going to talk about the idea of preaching and the importance of listening to preaching. We started that last week, and I'll be back to continue that in just a second. Now, last week I had two main points. The first one was that considering the fact that it takes pastors between 10 and 20 hours to prepare a sermon, that it is worth our while to listen to it, learn to listen to it in an optimal way. Second, I wanted to show very briefly that preaching has been and always will be a central part of God's helping his people to understand his word. Now, let me ask you a question. Has anyone ever taught you how to listen to a sermon? My guess is that you've probably never had a class or done any kind of a Bible study on that subject. And yet, considering the number of hours that you will invest over a year's time listening to someone preach, wouldn't it be a good idea to learn how to get the most out of that time? So that's what we want to talk about in this session. What are we to do when it's time to listen to a sermon? Let me give you a couple of suggestions. Number one, prepare to listen. Prepare to listen. For many people, Saturday is a day off, but it should not be a day where you stay up until 1 o'clock in the morning watching TV and get up with blurred vision to come to church on Sunday morning. If you do that, you're going to be trying to hold your eyelids open with toothpicks instead of being ready to hear the Bible taught well. If God's word is that important, that you're going to take an hour out of your weekend or 2 hours out of your weekend to go hear it taught, go to bed on time. That may sound radical, but it's actually a very reasonable solution to the problem of sometimes missing what the point of a sermon is all about. You're not going to pay a lot of attention if you're trying to keep yourself awake. In addition, let me encourage you to pray for the person who's preaching. That's also part of your preparation process as a listener. Pray for the person who's going to be speaking. Pray for the congregation, for your own listening, that God will speak to his people through his word. If we really believe that in our worship time together, that we're having an encounter with God's word, we ought to be praying for what takes place during that time that we gather as his people. Also, another way of preparing to listen is to read the passage that the sermon is going to be based on in advance if you happen to know it. In our church, we tell people what the sermon is going to be on the Friday before the sermon is preached. And so take a little bit of time on Saturday or Sunday and read the passage through so that you're ready to understand and listen. So that's the first thing, prepare to listen. Second thing, be there in person. Now, I know we've gone through COVID and we've gotten used to being able to watch our church services on live streaming. And that's been incredibly helpful. There's nothing wrong with that. But I want you to consider the benefits of being in person to hear a sermon preached. I enjoy going to concerts, but I would much rather be at a concert in person than listen to one that's taped or watch one on TV. There's just something different about it. And I would say the same thing is true for when we're dealing with hearing a sermon preached in person. We are able to share in the moment as a participant rather than being simply a spectator. So if you've gotten into the habit of just staying home and watching the sermon online, and you really don't have a good medical reason to do so, let me encourage you to get up, get yourself ready, and come out to church in person, because I think you'll get more from the sermon than just staying home and listening. However, if you have good reasons for not coming, it's certainly better to watch a live stream than do nothing. Okay, so I'm not trying to discourage you from watching the live streaming, but being there in person is really helpful. Thirdly, be an active listener. Now, the easiest way to be an active listener is to take notes, but that's not the only way. One of the ways that I engage with the sermon is by looking up a cross-reference, for example, and I want to be listening to what the pastor is saying. I don't want to embark on some journey that takes me down a bunny trail and not pay attention to what the pastor is preaching. But you can quickly look at a cross-reference, or, and this is something that's easier to do, to stay within the passage and make sure that you can connect what is being said to the scriptures itself. Where is the pastor getting his points from? Can you see how he's developed the points of his sermon? So be an active listener. Fourth, review what was said. In our church, there are questions on the note sheet that you can use to review what was said during the sermon. But then I'd suggest to you that you set a time midweek where you go back over the passage, at least, that the sermon came from. Maybe that's what you do on Wednesday or Thursday in your own Bible reading, is to review the passage. When you think about the fact that as soon as the sermon is over, there are other things that happen, good things, that will begin to intrude upon your mind. You will not remember everything that you would like to remember from what's preached. And one of the ways that you can help your memory is by refreshing it and going over what was said. If you have a note sheet, great. If you want to listen to the sermon, that's great too. It's good to hear it again sometimes. I usually listen to the sermons that I've preached so that I can say, oh man, why did I say that? Or, oh, I could have said that better. You don't need to do that really, though you can. But when you listen to a sermon, it will reinforce what you've heard on Sunday because you'll be hearing it for the second time. So review what was said. And then last, deliberately ask yourself, what is the main point of the sermon and how does it pertain to me? Ask yourself what you've learned. What was it that the passage is saying? What's the big idea of the passage? Or as Pastor Dave here says, the bottom line. What's the bottom line? And what is the response that's called for as a result of that passage? If you prepare to listen, if you prepare in advance, if you are there in person, if you are an active listener, if you review what was said, and if you ask those questions, you will find yourself engaging with the sermon on a deeper level than if you just came, sat with your arms folded, Bible open, and listened to the sermon being preached. I guarantee that. And since God has ordained that growth and salvation come through preaching God's word, I would encourage you to be a willing participant in the process. Now, there are two books I want to recommend. One is a small booklet, that thin, okay? You can get it for about $4 on Amazon or $3 in a Kindle version. It's called Listen Up. It's written by Christopher Ash. It's an easy-to-read booklet that you can go through in half an hour. The other one is also not all that terribly thick. It's called Expository Listening by Ken Ramey. And it's called The Handbook for Hearing and Doing God's Word. How you can get more out of the preaching that you hear on a week-to-week basis. I'd recommend both of these. They're available on Amazon, and I've listed them in the section below this video, reserved for some notes and articles and such and such. And that is all that I have. I will see you next week. God bless you.